In the morning, Glen awoke to warm kisses. His wife, Mary, sat next to him in bed and smiled softly. "Good morning," she said. "You were sleeping so sweetly." Glen stretched out in bed, turned and pulled Mary to him. Today promised to be a busy day. Glen had to take Mary to the train station in the morning after he drove to work, and in the evening he would meet some friends. "Remind me when you'll be back," asked the husband. "In 3 days. Today we have a work meeting, an acquaintance, and tomorrow a conference," answered the wife, packing the last things for the trip. Despite the fact that she was only going to a neighboring town, for several days the suitcase was full of outfits and shoes. Parting was hard for Glen, and it made him nervous this morning. "I'm going to miss you." Mary came up behind him, put her arms around him, and dabbed her nose on his neck. The drive to the train station, goodbye, work, the day flew by in an instant. The phone kept vibrating and blinking, because there were social media messages and pictures coming from Mary. This one showed her room, the view from the window. Another photo was of a restaurant she and her coworkers went to for lunch. Glen knew literally everything about her movements, where she would eat, what street her hotel was on, and where the conference for which her firm had conceived this trip would be held. Glen was on his way to a meeting with friends. At that moment, the phone blinked again and made a short beep. Mary sent a text saying that she had arrived at the hotel and was very tired, so she was going to bed and was turning her phone off. Glen sent her a gentle message back and said goodnight and put the phone in his pocket. Hi. His friends Nikita, Igor, and Demo were already waiting at the entrance to the bar. Everyone shook hands one by one. "How are you, Glen? Today, you are finally free from your wife restraining you?" Dima asked, and the whole company laughed. Unlike Glen, all the guys were free. At the bar, they sat down at a table and ordered a drink. "Glen, give us a smile. It's been 100 years since we've seen each other, and you sit there like at a funeral with a sad face," Nikita reproached his friend. "I can't. I miss Mary. At least now get behind the wheel, otherwise we should have taken the weekend off and gone together." The friends looked at each other and sighed together. "You're so boring." After sitting for another 15 minutes without touching his beer, Glen was determined to drive to Mary's other town and surprise her. After saying goodbye to his friends, he hailed a cab and drove home, where his car was parked in the driveway. He was so inspired by his deed that getting behind the wheel of his own car, Glen flew as if on wings to meet Mary. Some 200 kilometers separated him from her. The man drove along the empty highway, where signs flashed on the side. As he approached the city, Glen slowed down and turned on the navigator, writing the address of the hotel where his wife was staying. "Turn left in 20 meters. End point," the navigator said in a mechanical female voice. Glen found himself in front of an expensive hotel in the center of town. A smiling girl met him at the reception desk. "Good evening. How may I help you?" she asked politely. The name tag on her chest read Vera. "Vera," Glen addressed her. "I came here to surprise Glen. She's staying in room 278. Please tell me your wife's name, and we'll compare notes," she smiled. Glen gave his wife's first and last name. The receptionist said something on the computer in a concentrated manner. "I'm sorry. I don't want to upset you, but another person lives in this room. There is no one with this information registered at our hotel at all." "I'm sorry." Glen went pale and felt that the ground was slipping from under his feet. Grabbing the counter so he wouldn't fall from his dizziness, Glen asked, "What do you mean no one is registered? Check those names too." And he called out 3 more names of employees who were supposed to go with Mary to this conference. "No, there's no one." Vera answered again and looked at the man with sadness in her eyes. On cotton legs, Glen went outside and stood for a while longer, leaning against the railing and breathing in the night air. Somewhere nearby was a nightclub, and from there the music was inviting. Glen kept dialing and dialing Mary's number, but the only answers he got were beeps and voicemail. What to do now? Go home and wait. In 3 days, Mary would be back, and then Glen would take her out to talk, tell her he knew everything, and demand an explanation. Suddenly, he remembered that a couple of years ago, when he'd first given Mary a new phone, he put a program on there that tracked him in case his wife lost the phone or it was stolen. Finally freezing, Glen got in his car and opened the app on his phone. When it finally loaded, Glen clicked on the right icon, and a couple of seconds later a beacon and an address appeared on the screen. The address on the app was a nightclub. Throwing money on the counter to the receptionist, Glen made his way inside. There was a crowd around him, moving in a jaunty dance. Looking around, he didn't see any familiar faces. On the bar and behind it sat young men and women, quite drunk and happy. The music from the speakers roared and his heart raced. For a moment, Glen thought one of the girls sitting on the bar stool was his wife. As he made his way through the crowd to where he thought Mary was sitting, Glen saw her. She was wearing a bright dress, one strap of which fell off Mary's skinny shoulder. She sat on the counter, spreading her legs as wide as her dress allowed. On a chair between her legs rested a man Glen did not know. Mary laughed, and the man stroked her thighs and looked at her lustfully. The woman leaned toward him and kissed him. Their kiss lasted a long time. It seemed like an eternity to Glen. Breaking away from the man, Mary looked up and saw her husband. Putting the matching strap back in place, she deftly jumped off the counter and flew over to him. Her face reflected a range of emotions and tears welled up in her eyes. Mary covered her mouth with the palm of her hand. Tears welled up in her eyes and streamed down her cheeks. Glen looked at it and could not believe that even this morning he had happily escorted her here to her lover himself. Mary reached out her arms toward him in an attempt to touch him. Glen first recoiled, and then, without controlling himself, grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. Why? His cry was drowned out by the noise. He didn't wait for an answer, so he turned and left. His ears were still throbbing with emotion and loud music. Home he goes home. Driving out of town and sinking the pedal to the floor, Glen turned on the music and sank into heavy thoughts. He could not believe that his beloved wife, Mary, had betrayed him just like that. The next morning, Glen gathered all her things. He collected all the gifts he had given her, and that she had given him. All the things he bought together for the house, the books his wife liked to read in the evenings after work. It all ended up in a big box labeled junk. Going downstairs and opening the door to the street, the first thing he saw was Mary. A little further away was the car behind the driver's seat, which had been returned by the man from the club who had clamped her and whom she had kissed so passionately tonight. For a minute, they stared into each other's eyes. Mary was clutching her purse and Glen had a box in her hand. Take your trash and get out yourself. Finally, Glen squeezed out and threw the box at the woman's feet. Things were scattered, and lace underwear was left lying on the pavement near her feet. Mary rushed to collect everything, and Glen closed the door behind him with a feeling of a new lightness, not yet familiar to him, and went back to the apartment. Having relieved himself of the heavy load, he felt much better. The ex-wife wasted no time, and on the same day, she had already left her things in her lover's rented apartment. She was in no hurry to remarry. She was afraid to scare the man away. So they lived together for about 6 months, and then her lover began to treat Mary like a servant. Just serve, bring in the laundry, and no thanks or kind words in return. She tried to fill their relationship with the same warmth she had with her ex-husband. But this man was very different. He only wanted to receive without giving anything in return. Then he began to raise his hand against her, so much so that Ira was no longer comfortable with short dresses and open clothes. She was careful to hide her bruises from those around her. Her mutual acquaintances had already turned their backs on her after hearing Glen's stories. Now she didn't want them to know what she traded her happy marriage for. And when, after another argument, she ended up in the hospital. It was her parents who swooped in and took their daughter in. During her rehabilitation, she cried for a long time. Finally, she realized that she had made one of the biggest mistakes of her life. So that's the story. Share in the comments what you think about this situation and the behavior of the characters.